Should wait until I put on the hat.
Oh,
Okay, is it on? Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to start the Knauss Brown bag. So here is Katie O'Reilly. She is currently a 2018 Knauss Fellow, and she's serving in the science communication as a science communication specialist in the National Sea Grant Office. She is currently a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Notre Dame, studying the ecology of coastal Great Lakes food webs. And she received her bachelor's in marine science and biology from the University of Miami. So we're excited for your talk. Take it away, Katie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Got to get really in the spirit here, guys. So first off, thank you so much to everyone who has braved the first snowstorm of the season to come out here today in the library, and thank you to everyone online. It's very appropriate. Today we're talking about how it's beginning to look a bit like Fishmas, and it's starting to look very, very holiday-esque outside. So thanks for taking time out of your day to spend a few minutes with me to talk about how we talk about science. So when we talk about science, it's generally referred to as science communication, which is this very broad phrase that a lot of people interpret as being, have scientists talk more about what they do, about their research. But communication is really at the heart of science. As scientists, we communicate in many different ways, but primarily through peer-reviewed articles, through presentations at conferences. But what is an equally, if not more important type of communication happens outside of the halls of academia, happens outside of the conference center or the lab, and that's talking more broadly about science to different audiences. So when I talk about science communication today, I'm going to be going off of kind of this definition, which is the use of appropriate skills, media, activities, and dialogue that produces a personal response towards science. Personal response being things that are awareness, enjoyment, forming an opinion. And I just want to note that appropriate skills, because that's really what I'm going to talk a little bit more about as we go on here. Because when we're doing any type of communication, we need to determine what's appropriate. How do we do that? And really it comes down to kind of your basic who, what, when, where, and why. The first step in any communication effort, whether it's science or otherwise, is figuring out, just who are you talking to? Sounds silly, maybe obvious, but that's really the critical part, is identifying who your audience is. And, maybe that's briefing senior NOAA leadership. Maybe that's talking on a dock to a shrimper along the Gulf Coast. It's figuring out who you're talking to, and more so than just who they are, figuring out and understanding more what they're interested in, what is important to them. It's knowing the perspectives that they're bringing and the context in which their lives are happening, so that your science and you're talking about science can be applicable to their lives. So you figured out who you're going to be talking to, who your audience is. The next question you need to ask yourself is, what do you want them to know? What are the key facts you want them to take away? And kind of beyond just what you want them to know, what do you want them to do with that information that you have given them? Do you want them to take some sort of further action now that they are, aware or enjoy your science? From there, you kind of have to think about the timing of your communication. When does your audience need to know this information? Because the timing in which your audience receives information can actually affect how they receive it. Where? And this is actually gets back a little bit to figuring out who your audience is. It's figuring out where your audience gets their information and their news from. Again, this goes back to understanding who you're talking to, and is it an audience that maybe relies on traditional media, such as newspapers, local television stations for their information and news? Alternatively, it could be that the audience that you are trying to reach is more receptive to face-to-face communication. It's not dead just yet. And alternatively, and what I'm going to be talking a lot about in the following slides, is using social media as a way of reaching your audience. Social media is increasing in popularity, so that's a place where an audience that I'm looking for may go, and that's where I would meet them. And finally, perhaps the most existential of the questions is why? This kind of ties everything together with a nice bow. And why does your audience need to know this information? Why are you doing this communication? And so I'll let you ponder on that one as we go along. But that's really kind of more of the figuring out what your goal is in doing a science communication and giving you a purpose. So one of the things that I find really cool about social media is that it's really similar to science. At both the core of science and social media is sharing information and that kind of transfer of knowledge. When I say social media, I'm primarily referring to content sharing platforms, things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the like. I have a few up here that you can see. Pardon the tables. I hate showing tables in presentations, but just giving you an idea that this is a growing area where people receive information. When the Pew Research Center began tracking social media adoption in 2005, only 5% of American adults used a social media platform, but today it's up to about 70% of American adults use one or more social media platforms on a very frequent basis, in most cases checking daily or weekly for updates. For today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on Twitter, as it's where I've done most of my science communication efforts, and it is a very incredibly popular social media platform. It's got about 500 million users worldwide. As you can maybe notice on this terrible table, it has about a quarter of American adults use Twitter as well. So it's not as prolific as, say, Facebook, which has about 70% of American adults, but it is still a very popular platform. And the reason I like using Twitter for doing my science communication efforts is because it's what's known as a microblogging site. So what that weird tech savvy phrase means is that it's meant to share content in a very concise, kind of packaged way. Some of you may have been familiar. Twitter used to be known for having posts limited to 140 characters. Now it's 280. That's a whole other kettle of fish. But even with 280 characters, Twitter is still very much about keeping your message concise and direct to the point. And I find that's a great way of communicating with your audience, and it forces you to learn some tips and tricks to make that happen. But I want to stress that social media and Twitter within that are just tools to be used. They're not the end-all be-all to science communication. You have to go where your audience is. If your audience is on social media, you use social media, but it is not a kind of one-size-fits-all thing. So to talk a little bit more and give you a little more example of how you can do science communication using social media, I'm going to talk a little bit about a campaign I created called 25 Days of Fishmas. So, what is 25 Days of Fishmas? The grand answer. Basically, it's combining two of my great loves, Great Lakes fish species and terrible fish puns. As a grad student studying Great Lakes coastal wetlands, I get to see, Great Lakes fish species all the time. It's so cool. These are awesome creatures. But I realize that not everyone gets that opportunity. People, with aquatic ecosystems, it can be tough to, if people aren't out there fishing, they're not out there. Not a whole lot of people go snorkeling in the Great Lakes. Don't know why. But it's not something that people see all the time. And so it's kind of this understated resource that is out there. And not a lot of people are aware of the diversity of fish species within the Great Lakes. And while I was, stumbling along as you do in grad school, I came across this poster created by Wisconsin Sea Grant, which kind of is a Great Lakes feature. And for some reason, something in my brain was reminded of those Advent calendars. There are these basically calendars for the month of December that lead up to December 25th, where there's a little door for each day, and you open the door to find a treat. I kind of built upon this idea that, you open a door for each day, your treat is a bunch of fish facts. So each day in December, I feature one Great Lakes fish species and give some kind of basic facts, tell stories, all focused on that one species. And while it was inspired by, the holiday season, this is just a totally secular celebration of all things fishy, kind of bringing people together across the Great Lakes region and beyond. And other people seem to like it too. Because I'm a scientist, I can't give a talk without at least one figure in it. So this is a chart of my Twitter followers against the date. So this is pre-first 25 days of Fishmas back in 2016. And when I started this whole crazy thing in 2016, I gained about 350 Twitter followers just within the month of December. It was something that just really blew up in that first month. But more importantly than just the gaining more followers, what was more rewarding was that I became more engaged with the existing followers I had. Engagement on Twitter is measured by how many times, someone shares or retweets your post or likes it. And my engagement rate within that month went up significantly compared to what it had been kind of on average previously. And it even attracted some of the attention of local news stations. There was a news organization called Great Lakes Today, which called me for an interview, and they were like, yeah, we see this is getting really popular on social media. You want to talk about it? And I'm like, this was something I just kind of threw together. Like, okay, sure. So that first year was kind of like, the unexpected lightning in a bottle, where it was a concept that people really drew to. And it was kind of my first foray into the world of science communication. So then year two, I had a little better understanding. I knew what I was getting myself into this time around. And we kept spreading the Fishmas cheer. What was really cool about the second year, last year, of doing 25 Days of Fishmas was that a lot of other people kind of got in on the act. I had people reach out to me before December saying, hey, we really liked what you did last year. Would you mind if we did something similar? And I was like, sure, that's awesome. Go for it. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I still think it's the coolest thing ever. I'm still amazed by it. But it was really cool to see other people latch onto that model of being like, hey, let's share fish species each day in December. We had everything from the crypto Fishmas, which was about cryptic reef fishes, to different organizations. So like the Florida Museum did their own 25 Days of Fishmas. Oregon Fish and Wildlife Service did their own 25 Days of Fishmas. And then even different species. Someone made a bivalve 25 Days of Fishmas, which, 25 Days of bivalves doesn't have quite the same ring to it, but silent nitrogen, that's a good one. So what was really cool is that I stayed kind of focused on Great Lakes fish species, because that's kind of my wheelhouse. But it was awesome seeing people take this concept and run with it. And I did my best to encourage and promote the other posts. It wasn't like I felt like they were competing. I felt like they were expanding upon this really awesome thing. So full disclaimer, I am not a communications expert. My background, as I said, is aquatic ecology. But now that I've got 2 years of Fishmas under my belt, I took the time to reflect on some of the things that did and didn't work over the years. And while I was thinking about this, there were kind of 5 things in particular that stuck with me. And, as I'm thinking about this, I, think of that classic Christmas song, The 12 Days of Christmas, where instead of 5 golden rings, I've got my 5 rings of SciComm. So repetition, images, narrative, goals, and schedule. So I got these 5 rings. I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of them in detail, but that's kind of the 5 things that really made Fishmas work. So starting with repetition, one of the most effective ways to communicate any message is by repeating it. Every day we receive thousands and thousands of messages coming our way about, everything. And just to illustrate that, on Twitter, it's something like 6,000 tweets are posted every second. So we're just in this very high information, getting things thrown at us all the time. And so hearing messages multiple times can be helpful, especially, maybe your followers missed the message the first time around. So how I incorporated this concept into Fishmas in a way that made things successful was starting each day with that Wisconsin Sea Grant fish poster. And just showing you an example, each day the fish, so the numbers correspond to the day it was presented. So each day they would get a number, and then the next day the poster would be updated with the new number for that day's fish. They also get a little Santa hat if they are a native species to the Great Lakes. And anyone want to guess what the Grinch hat is for? Invasive. So yeah, the non-native species. And so it was funny, they get their hat the day after they're featured, but people were freaking out. They're like, why don't they have a hat yet? It's like, just wait, they're getting their hat. So that was kind of that repetition of each day they were reminded of the calendar, of where we had been, what we had talked about. Other things that kind of fit within the umbrella of repetition for SciComm is the use of hashtags. So obviously I've got the hashtag 25 Days of Fishmas. Seeing that repeated over and over again on every post not only reinforces that idea, but it also aggregates all of those tweets or posts together. So other people could post about Fishmas and use that hashtag, which was then helpful when I would make these recaps of the week there used to be this thing called Storify, which would just you could bring tweets with a single hashtag all together and make a nice little cute story about it. Now Twitter does something called Twitter Moments, which is basically the same concept. But so the hashtags were nice to aggregate and keep bringing that, that thought, that concept up over and over again. So when we talk about images, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I would argue a GIF or, the silent movies that we have on the internet are worth even more. They're kind of these quick little videos that are posted. And when we talk about Twitter or any of the social media platforms that are really, high information overload, having a very striking image or video is a way to make your information stand out from the crowd. And in some cases, images are more effective than text in conveying certain messages. So for this example, I was talking about bowfin one day, which is a fish that has this parental behavior where the male bowfin basically corrals the young into a ball to keep them all protected, and he just guards them. And that's something that's kind of difficult to just convey in text, but if you see it, that's a lot, you can make that connection a lot more easily. Narrative is really, as it says, telling a story. So to talk about narrative, I'm going to walk you through a random day of Fishmas. This is a day when we talked about the alewife, which is a non-native species in the Great Lakes. Each day, as I said, starts out with the Wisconsin Sea Grant Advent Calendar. Then I would introduce some just basic taxonomic information as well as an image of the fish so that people knew what the fish looked like. But then from there, it was kind of like I I didn't want to just tell basic facts. I wanted to tell a story about this fish. So I talked about how in its native range it is anadromous, meaning it goes between freshwater and the marine ecosystems. And this set the stage that it is, in its native range, it has this life history, which sets us up into talking about how the fish was introduced to the Great Lakes. Talking about how there's some controversy about where it's native. Talking about how it became established, what were the conditions in the Great Lakes that allowed it to become established. If any of you are familiar with the Great Lakes, there used to be times when we would have big piles of rotting alewives because they would have die-offs. And, talking about that is a memory that some people have of the Great Lakes. And then I would always try and tie in some art. So this is a mural in Chicago that was made in 1972 depicting one of these massive alewife die-offs. Really what I wanted to do with these posts was not just tell the ecological or the science side of the story, but talk about the impacts on humans as well. And so I always tried to tie in some kind of art, music, making that human connection. So goals. We're thinking about that why. Why am I doing this science communication? And as I said, the first year, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. I'll admit I did not have super defined goals at the beginning, so I didn't know this was going to be something that resonated with people so well. But the second year, I took some time before December came around and thought about what are the things I want to happen. And I thought about what were some of the things that I really was drawn to during that first year of Fishmas, and that was people sharing not only their science, but sharing their stories, sharing their perspectives. And so I think in terms of a goal, I was really looking to encourage that sharing and that dialogue of communities. I was having people come together, creating their own, Fishmas stories. They were sharing times they caught a fish in the Great Lakes. They were sharing their kids catching fish. One of the things that really stuck with me is someone was talking about how they just remember going to the beach when they were young and there being like a dead pile of alewives, and how they just remember they were like 3 years old at the time, and they remember that like so vividly in their mind. And so it was having people share these anecdotes, share these memories that they had in the context of understanding environmental change and the Great Lakes in general. So that was me setting my goals. My goal was to foster this conversation that we were having amongst a lot of different diverse participants, not just academics. Moving from the existential more to the logistical side of things, the scheduling is really kind of an understated part of, I think, what made Fishmas work for me. So I put up a few tweets here just to show you. I was pretty good about each day starting around the same time. And this actually was good for about 2 reasons. One was it was good for people to expect when they were going to see a Fishmas post that had that consistency, that repetition. And 2, it made sure that I had to be ready to go each morning, which helped with my own time management. Funnily enough, during the first year of Fishmas 2016, I was taking my qualifying exams for my Ph.D. at the same time this was going on. So time management was really, really essential for me. And there are tools that can help you schedule posts on social media to go for different times, third-party platforms like TweetDeck or Hootsuite that can help you fine-tune that timing. So, I got my rings of SciComm, and there's other lessons I've picked up along the way, other best practices. The first is when using social media to do science communication, you have to be human. And that means not being afraid to put yourself out there, put your personality out there, which can be intimidating because, as a scientist, you're putting, you're writing reports, you're writing papers, and you're taking yourself out of it and letting the science stand on its own. But in social media, people want to know the human behind the science. Fact checking, double, triple, quadruple checking before you post, because once you put something out there on the internet, it's out there. But regardless of how careful you are, how many times you fact check, there are going to be mistakes. And what I found is that the best course of action is acknowledging those mistakes. Again, that goes back to the being human side of things. We're human, we err. But then being sure to make corrections and to make that correction kind of obvious. People respect that and can, they won't necessarily crucify you for making a mistake if you own up to it. If you hadn't noticed by now, I really like humor in communicating science. I mean, heck, that was the whole reason I did the Fishmas. And humor is a really powerful tool, but it has to be used carefully. I recommend using humor that's positive and good-spirited, that's inclusive of groups. I mean, I do silly things like what I have up here is a fish called a weatherfish, stuck on the head of a meteorologist. It's things that are a little silly, but I try and stay away from kind of mean-spirited, sarcastic humors, keep it a little more positive and inclusive. And then finally, giving credit where credit is due. If you use images, videos, etc., that aren't your own, just making sure that you attribute them properly. And just kind of on the vein of using images, making sure that everything is accessible. Twitter does allow you to add like alt text to your images, and I try and check to make sure things that I'm going to be posting are colorblind friendly. So I can't say that Fishmas was all me, because I had a lot of help from people I've never met before. The one cool thing about Twitter is you can have people you've never met make connections with you, and I wanted to point out these individuals specifically as kind of being my OG Fishmas crew that really helped support. They added their perspectives, they added their experiences, and they made Fishmas more of a community effort. And I'll end kind of on with community, and these are just some of the photos that people shared with me throughout the years. There's so many more, and that was the thing that I took most out of this science communication effort, was this community building, bringing people together, everything from recreational anglers to agency scientists to academics, to having and fostering this conversation about the Great Lakes and about the challenges it faces, while also celebrating the things that make it so awesome. So I know I'm running close on time, but if there is any time, I would be happy to take any questions. And thanks again for coming along on this snowy day. Yeah.
My name is Nicholas. I work in the content program office. Also went to the University of Miami.
Oh, very cool.
Okay.
Good to have another cane, yeah.
So now that you're more familiar with the analytical side of science communication, what are your expectations for Fishmas this year? It's coming up in December. And do you have any new strategies that you're trying to implement this year to increase any followers or something along those lines?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question was, because I've got more of these analytical skills, I've got a couple of years of Fishmas under my belt, what are the things I'm thinking about for 2018 in terms of making Fishmas great? I would say I've spent a lot of time actually pre-planning things. I've been working actually since about August on Fishmas stuff, here and there, really doing a lot. I'm actually branching out this year to Great Lakes tributaries. So because we've kind of done some of the big players in the Great Lakes, things like Lake Sturgeon, really talking about some even lesser known fish. And I think that'll be kind of cool to sparking the discussion. But yeah, I think, again, just building on the community connections I've made and utilizing that resource and network that I have will be kind of the goals with this year.
How big is the network? Did it expand outside of the Great Lakes?
Oh yeah, it definitely started expanding outside of the Great Lakes. I'd say the first year was mostly a Great Lakes network. but we had people from around the world. I had people from like the UK who were like active participants in last year's Fishmas. So it's gone worldwide, which is cool. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering how many posts you were doing each day, and also were you like transferring your posts to Facebook or Instagram?
Yeah. So the question was, how many posts were I posting per day, and then was I also translating those to Facebook, Instagram? I originally started doing about 9 or 10 posts a day, kind of threaded on Twitter, which threading just means replying to an original tweet. So they're all kind of in a line. I think 10 is a little much, so I'm going down to about 6 or 8. And I do those throughout the day. So I post obviously at 8 a.m. every morning because I'm not anal or anything. But I then do the posts throughout the day so that it keeps coming up on people's news feeds. I did not do anything on Facebook or Instagram, but it's funny. I think I've heard that people were taking the post, and there was another organization posting them on Facebook, like taking my post and doing that, which, you know, is cool, awesome. And I think they attributed me, so it wasn't like they were just taking it for their own. But I don't really use Facebook for science communication, so I didn't really do that at transfer. But great question, thank you.
And we do have one question
Okay.
online. On crediting images, how were images, videos identified as being able to be used, and then how were they accredited appropriately?
Yeah, so the question of attribution is always a really important one. And for me, it was, if I could find the direct author, I would try and reach out to them and be like, you know, I'd like to use this. Here's kind of what the context in which it's going to be used. And in most cases, it was like, yeah, sure, go right ahead. If I could not find the author, I'd, you know, use the trusty Google reverse image search. See if you can find the original place where it was posted and at least link it to them. But I tried to stay away from that if possible. Just, you know, as a best practice, it was kind of like, okay, unless there is no other place I can get this image, I'm going to try and stick to something where I know I have permission, because no one likes to see their images shared without their permission online. Awesome.
Any more questions?
Cool. Thank you all again. It was great.
Thank you.